So we're going to continue our series on the Sermon on the Mount. It feels like it's been a while because it has. We've had 3 weeks where we've been away from this series, but we're going to get back into it. And I asked Courtney if she would read the Beatitudes as well, even though that was their first couple Sundays, just as a reminder. But the text we're going to look at this morning is 13 to 16, about what it means to be the salt of the earth and light on the world. This is a pretty familiar passage. If you've been around church for any amount of time, you have heard a sermon or two on what it means to be salt and light. Scott and Andy, you guys have probably done youth talks on this somewhere along the way, I'm sure. Preachers like it. Salt and light, these are easy metaphors for us to work with, and so we like preaching on this. There's lots of speculation about what salt might mean. One commentator has 11 different possible meanings of what it means to be salt of the earth. I think Jesus doesn't explain what it means to be salt of the earth because he just told us what it means to be the salt of the earth. And when he went through the Beatitudes and he talked about being merciful and being meek and being pure in heart, all of those things, that's what it means to be salt. He said it already in the Beatitudes. So this is what it means. If you want to know the answer of what it means to be salt, it means acting like this. It means becoming like Christ in these sorts of things. That's how you become salt. And Jesus' only concern is that you don't stop being salty. We take these verses, being salt of the earth, and we sort of lift them out of the context and we talk about them by themselves. They're right after Jesus talked about being persecuted. Jesus understands that if you live his way, some people are going to persecute you. They're going to say falsely all kinds of evil against you, and you are going to be tempted to stop being salty. And so Jesus says, don't stop being salty. That's where this comes from. We can all think of Christians who've stopped being salty. And we look at our own lives, we can look at periods of our lives where we've seen that too. I'll tell you, one of the worst things in the world is someone who says they're a Christian, but they don't act like it. They've lost their saltiness, or they were never salt in the first place. The church can face all kinds of hurdles and obstacles, and we can overcome all kinds of things. One of the hardest things for the church to overcome is people who say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but they don't actually live like it. That's the most detrimental thing for the church. And this is what Jesus warns us again, to not stop being salty. Because we have an impact on the world. Whether we intend to or not, every one of us is like a book being read by the world. And they read us, whether it's good or bad, which is why Jesus gives us these strong warnings. These are images of impact, salt and light. Salt impacts food. I think you all know that if you cook. Cooking is entirely different without salt. It makes a huge difference. If you eat a cucumber without salt and you eat a cucumber with salt, it makes a big difference. Some people put salt on watermelon. Do any of you guys do that? I just discovered this. You shouldn't do that. That's really weird. But people do that because salt has an impact. It makes an impact on food. When I was in college, you always had your tray, and the cups were small, so you'd usually get about 3 cups of Coke or whatever, and you know that if you leave the table and you come back, even though you forget about it, that first sip that you take from your Coke is going to be full of salt, because when you left the table, somebody dumped salt in your cup. I remember I did that once, and I took a drink, and it was just full of salt. But I had another Coke, so I drank that one to wash it away. That one was even full of salt. But I had a chocolate milk, so I grabbed my chocolate milk to wash down those 2 bad ones, and of course that was full of salt, and all my friends laughed and laughed and laughed, and I ran around the cafeteria looking for something to wash the taste out. But salt has a real impact. You notice it when it's there. That's why Jesus uses this metaphor, and it was something that his people would have understood. There was a little town right close to the Sea of Galilee called Magdala, where Mary Magdalene is from, and it was known for its salted fish. They could take fish out of the Sea of Galilee and send them all the way to Rome with no refrigeration, nothing, just salt. And so this was a picture that Jesus' people understood. And I brought with me a little show and tell this morning. Here's a chunk of salt from the Dead Sea. I dug this up myself from the bottom of the Dead Sea, and it broke when I moved and now it's like a third the size. But we're going to leave this here as a little visual reminder of what it means for us to be salt in this world, because salt has an impact on what it comes in contact with. And in the same way, light has an impact on what it comes in contact with. Evenings are entirely different if you don't have light. And none of us here have probably been, when's the last time you were 50 miles away from any source of light? And I mean not the dashboard lights in your car, no light at all. We don't experience real darkness because we just have street lights and ambient light. And if I go into my house with all the lights are off, it's still light because the microwave has a light and the stove has a light and the computer has a light. We just have this all over. But in Jesus' world, understand this isn't how light operates, right? There is no electric light, obviously. And so if your little house, which is a stone house with probably no windows, if it has no light, it's black, it's dark. But if you have a lamp, like I do, here's a little lamp that I got from a little town called Nazareth. You might have heard of it. And it's filled with olive oil, the same way that the Israelites and the Jewish people would have done it. I trimmed my wick this morning. I didn't know anything about that till today. You would be amazed what that little light, how that little light can impact a pitch dark house. This little light in perfect blackness, you could see it, the average person could see it from 1.6 miles away. That's how much light impacts darkness. And Jesus says, you're like a city on a hill, that sort of light that you can see at night. And so here's a city. When we go to Israel, we stay on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and you look across the sea, and you see this town, which is called Tiberias. And it's a city on a hill. And that town was there when Jesus was there, and obviously it didn't have all the streetlights it has today. But it was a perfect example. Jesus would point to that hill and say, just like you can't hide that city, that's what you, as my followers, are supposed to be like. And notice that it's plural. You don't notice it in English, but in Greek, it's plural. It's not you, your individual, shine like a light, but all of us together, when we live Jesus' way, this is what we look like. We look like a city on a hill that impacts the world around us. So how do we do this? What does it mean to live, to be salt and to be light? It's being beatitude people. It's back to these things. The rest of this Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus is going to show us what it looks like to be light in this world. We read the rest of the Gospels, everything that Jesus teaches us, and not only what he teaches us, but what he embodies himself. The way Jesus actually lives, the example he gives, that's being salt, that's being light. And when we think that being salt and light is just between me and God, we've missed it. You know, God wants me to be merciful, so I better be merciful so God will be happy with me or less mad with me. That's not the point of living this sort of way. The point of living this way is that there are all kinds of people around us who are poor in spirit and are not coming to God because they don't see us as poor in spirit coming to God. The point of living this way is that there's a world around us watching. And Jesus says, they are going to see the way you live, they are going to see your good deeds, and they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. So the point of us living this way is not that God's less angry with us when we act like this. The point of us living this way is that people see it. The way you see a city on a hill and they're drawn to the Father. One of a great little quote I came across from a theologian named Brian Stone. He says, the most evangelistic thing the church can do today is to be the church. If we want to win the world around us, if we want to do evangelism, the most evangelistic thing we can do is to be beatitude people, is to actually live and embody a radical lifestyle. If we really want our community to know Jesus, and I know there are lots of people in this room who desire that with all their heart, and I know that this church was founded on a desire to meet this community. If we want that to happen, the greatest thing that we can do is become a family of people who live Jesus' way. because they will see it. They will see our good deeds, they will see the way we live, and they will glorify the Father in heaven. Notice there's nothing evangelistic in the Beatitudes. There's nothing in those blesseds that Courtney just read that even hint about preaching or anything like that. It's largely a list of good works. And in our minds, that would never be enough just to live that way. But according to Jesus, in this passage, it's enough. The easiest evangelism in the world is when we live this sort of life of radical being merciful and being peacemakers and pure in heart. And people see that and say, that's incredible. I don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Explain to me why you're living that way. That's easy. That's the easiest way. And I know that some of you have come to this church through channels like that. And I'm not saying there's not a call for evangelists. Absolutely there is. And there's a place for preaching the good news. The question is, are they looking at our lives and saying, wow, God is amazing because of what I see happening in your life? Do they see how we treat each other and say, that's different? I don't know other people who act like that to each other. Do they see how we treat the world and say, that's strange? Why are you living that way? This is Jesus' primary evangelism strategy. Now, I am not a strategist. I'm not concerned with church growth. All those conferences on pastors, on how to grow your church and how to build a bigger and better church, those rub me the wrong way, to say it gently. My primary focus in shepherding this flock is not to put on all sorts of programs to reach out to people. Sometimes there's a place for programs. But Jesus never hinted that would work. I have very little interest in building a teaching ministry to teach unbelievers how good God is. Those aren't bad things. God uses them. But his primary strategy, Jesus' primary strategy, is to live this out, to actually embody this beatitude sort of lifestyle. And people are going to see it, Jesus says, and they're going to glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's the line I want to focus on this morning. That they will see our good deeds and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So my vision for our church is twofold. And they build off each other, but one has to come first. And first of all, that we become beatitude people to one another. Not just the Beatitudes, not just those 8 blesseds, but the whole Sermon on the Mount. And not just the whole Sermon on the Mount, but all of Jesus' teaching and everything that Jesus lived, that we would become that to each other. That we would have a Christ-like humility and selflessness towards each other. Inside these 4 walls is what I'm talking right now. If we don't do this first, there is no point in winning anybody outside our community into this. If this is dysfunctional, there's no point in winning more people to share in this dysfunction. And I'm not at all saying our church is dysfunctional. I think we actually do this really well. But Jesus says this is first. We need to start by acting like this towards one another. And then, out of that, when we become beatitude people, when we become peacemakers, when we become merciful to people, when we're pure in heart and we stop pretending with each other, that overflows. And it's going to overflow into our community, and people are going to see it, and they're going to give glory to our Father in heaven. And I see how this already, in many of you, naturally is overflowing. And it's so encouraging for me to see. But this is my vision. This is Jesus' vision, actually, of how we reach our community. It's not so much about programs and having the right program, but it's about actually having a group of people who say, yes, I'm going to live Jesus your way. And the world, how is the world going to respond? Well, they're going to do one of 2 things. First, they might persecute us. They might insult us and falsely say all kinds of evil against us. Jesus just talked about that happening. Some will do that. It's not good, but Jesus says it's going to happen, so we just keep on going anyways. The second response is that they're going to be attracted to our Father in heaven. They're going to want to know what is behind this. Why are you so merciful to that person who just did that to you? Why are you talking the way you're talking? They're going to want to know a God who moves in people that way. And it's important to know we can't control the results. You cannot control whether someone is going to insult you or give glory to your Father in heaven. That's not up to us. Our job is to faithfully live out this beatitude lifestyle. And this is more than just being nice, folks. I'm not just calling us to be nice people. We're already all really nice people. And I've met lots of people in this community who are not Christians and never go to church, and they're really nice people too. This is about more than just being nice. This is about radically living Jesus' generous lifestyle. This might be going to Prairie Harvest and buying a $10 meal and leaving a $10 tip. That kind of crazy generosity that just flows out of you naturally. Not because a pastor told you you should do that, but saying, boy, when Jesus lived, he was generous with everything that he had. Can I live with that sort of generosity? It's suffering a wrong when someone does you a wrong and you sit in the coffee shop and someone brings it up and you refuse to say a bad word about that person. That's the kind of radical witness that I'm talking about. That's beyond just being nice person. That's the kind of stuff that people look at and say, what's going on here? Why are you acting the way you're acting? Why are you doing what you're doing? This is how the early church grew. Most people in the early church, you might be surprised to know, didn't feel a strong call to evangelize. There were appointed evangelists and apostles who did that sort of stuff. But most people, the other 99% who were not evangelists, they poured themselves into living Jesus' way. I don't want to idealize them. They weren't perfect Christians. They're just like you and me. But they understood reaching the world in a way that's different than we do. Mostly what they did is they invested their lives in these kinds of good works that Jesus just talked about. And these Christians, they shone like that city on a hill. These early Christians had very little money. They had no political power. They had very few missionaries actually going out. They had violent persecution against them, and yet they grew by about 40% per decade. That church grew. In the year 30 or so, there was about 120 Christians. By the end of the 3rd century, there were 6 million Christians with no money, no political power, and violent persecution against them, because they lived radically different lives than the rest of the Roman Empire. Let me just give you a couple examples. Abortion was pretty common in the Roman Empire, more common than you'd realize. And if that didn't work, if a woman had a baby she didn't want, they would simply abandon it. And this was called infanticide, and they would take an unwanted baby and leave it at the garbage dump. And there's too many young ears in this room for me to explain what happened from there on. But that was a very common practice. And the Christians said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to abandon our babies. We're actually going to keep every single one and value them. And not only that, these Christians went to those garbage dumps and they took these abandoned babies and they raised them as their own. Nobody else was doing that, but the Christians did that. It was a radical witness to the world. It was nothing about preaching or evangelism. It was about, I'm going to do something. And people saw that and they said, why would you take that abandoned baby? And they said, well, because God made everyone in his image. This little baby is an image bearer. They cared for the sick. In those early years of the church, of those first couple centuries, there were epidemics that went through, plagues, where millions of people died. And you would take care of your family if you could, but beyond that, it didn't really happen. But these Christians, they did something different. They started caring for sick people who weren't even in their family. And in that world, there was no hospitals, there was no health care. Christians invented hospitals. Did you know that? Often the difference between life and death for someone in one of those epidemics was, could they get a glass of water? They were too sick on their bed to even have the energy to get out of bed to drink, and they would die of dehydration. But the Christians came along, and they weren't doctors or nurses, but they could bring someone a glass of water. That might have been the difference between life and death. This is how they lived. They embodied everything that Jesus taught and everything that Jesus did. This is how these Christians lived. And they grew like crazy because people looked at this, and that was a huge contrast to the rest of the way people lived in the Roman Empire. Nobody else was doing the kinds of things that Christians did. I'm not saying we replicate the early church. That's not our job. But there is a way for us to live out these Beatitudes in our context. There is a way for us to be just as radical, just as generous, just as Christ-like in our little communities as these Christians were in the Roman Empire. But often we get distracted from this basic way of life. And let me say a few things, not about Cornerstone in particular, but about Christians in general. Sometimes we spend far too much time and energy protesting the government and laws that we don't like, thinking that if our country just had the right laws, people would come to Jesus. That was never Jesus' strategy. We spend far too much time and energy arguing with people on the internet over creation or evolution or gay marriage or whatever, thinking that if we can just convince them that we're right and they're wrong, somehow they're going to come to Jesus. That was never Jesus' strategy. We spend far too much time and energy making our church try to look attractive, to have good singing and good worship and a good preacher with good PowerPoint and whatever, thinking if we can do that well, people are going to come to Jesus. That was never Jesus' strategy. Jesus said they're going to see the way you live, they're going to see your good deeds, and they will be drawn to the Father who is in heaven. That's Jesus' plan. And we say, that's great, Jesus. Yeah, we'll try to do that. But we've also got all these other things we want to do. We've got these programs and ideas that we're going to reach out. We go on with all sorts of ways that we come up with to reach our community. And frankly, it's not going very well. It's not like the world is beating down the door of our churches saying, we want in because of all your great programs. And I'm not against programs. Our church has some programs. God uses programs. I simply want to say programs are not the way to reach our world. So we often add on, we do our own way because it's easier. It's actually easier to put on some sort of a program than to live Jesus' way. Being merciful to people, when you really think about it, this is not easy. Loving your enemies is not easy. It's way easier to have a movie night and invite your friends. The whole Sermon on the Mount is not easy. Jesus says, this is the narrow path. This is the hard way of doing things. But Jesus says, when we live this way, we are like a city on a hill, and we will shine in Crystal City and in Pilot Mound and in every one of our communities that we are part of. So the question is, do we want to live this way? Do we as a group of Christians want to commit to living this way with each other and with the people around us? And I'm convinced that if we have a desire to reach our community, the best thing we can do is live this way. And the number of people who will insult us is actually pretty small. I think the vast majority of people are going to glorify our Father who's in heaven. Stanley Hauerwas is a guy I look up to for what he says about the church. He says, this church knows that its most credible form of witness, the most effective thing it can do for the world, is the actual creation of a living, breathing, visible community of faith. The best thing we can do for our town is to become a living, breathing body of Christ right here, with each other, first and foremost. The best thing we can do is not to invite them to church or to try to strike up a spiritual conversation in some sort of awkward way. Most of us are doing very little of this anyway. These things will happen, and that's good. They're not the method. The best thing we can do is to be the church. Tangible, practical acts of mercy and kindness for people who don't deserve it. Christ-like living of humility and self-sacrifice. The way that Jesus gave himself up, and obviously the cross is the ultimate example of that. Jesus says, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. And don't hear me saying as a church we're not doing this. I think we are doing this in lots of ways, and I want to encourage us to do this more. I was encouraged this morning in our Sunday school. I learned that when our church did the spiritual gifts test, our church was abnormally high in the gift of giving. We have a lot of people in this church who already are doing this, and let's do this more. I see people in our church loving each other well. I see you caring for each other, and as a pastor, I get to see more of it than some of you do maybe. We are doing this. Let's do this well. And I see this happening in our community. I know that some of you are very involved in our communities, and I know that the way that you live your life is a witness to people. They cannot help but notice it, and you are being consistent and you have integrity. So we start with our church. We look around our church in this room here, and if we see practical needs, we meet them. There should be nobody in this church who has needs that are unmet. We have more than enough to meet all the needs of one another. And so if it means that you feel like, boy, I got to slip $100 in an envelope in someone's mailbox anonymously, then you do that. And if it means you need to help someone work their field because they're having a tougher year than you, then you do that. If it means bringing a meal to someone, then you do that. And if it's a relational need, if you see someone in this church who you think, boy, I wonder how often they get invited out for coffee, then you invite that person out for coffee. These are the things that we do. And it's not just a list of tasks. I don't want to say it's just give money, farm someone's field, go for coffee. It's actually becoming this kind of person, that we're merciful to each other, that we are peacemakers with each other, that we're pure in heart. We don't pretend to be something with each other that we're not. And that we do this really well in here. And I'll be the first to admit I struggle with doing this well. Sometimes I'm greedy or I'm selfish, and I'm worried that I might not have enough if I try to meet that need. And you know what? There's other people in this church who have more than me. They can meet that need. Or sometimes I see a relational need and I think, I don't know if I have it in me to meet that need. I'll just maybe look the other way and hope they get their need met somewhere else. I struggle with loving my enemies and trying to do good things for people who aren't my favorite kind of people. We all struggle, but that doesn't mean we don't carry on in this. But you can probably think of needs in this congregation that you could meet. And this morning, I want to ask you to pick one. I want to ask you right now in this moment, Holy Spirit, would you speak to our hearts? Would you speak to us and would you say, put something on us, some way that we can become beatitude people towards one another right now? Maybe it's somewhere in the community. Maybe there's someone completely undeserving and unlovable that you know, and God has put that person on your heart right now, that you would find a way this week to show that kind of radical, generous, Christ-like love to that person. The goal of this is not church growth. If that's our goal, people will see through this and they'll know we're just being nice to them so they'll come to our church. Please don't have that in the back of your mind anywhere. We live like this because this is how Jesus lived. Some are going to insult, some are going to praise. That's not up to us. We live like this because this is what Jesus calls us to. We're salt and light because we impact the world around us. The way that salt impacts food, the way that light impacts darkness. And I want to say this sermon, this is for everyone. This is not for teachers or preachers or evangelists. Not everybody is those things. Every one of us, young and old, we are called to be salt and light. So God's at work in this world, and He's at work through us. Isn't it interesting that Jesus doesn't say, I am the salt of the earth and I am the light of the world? If He said that, that would fit fine into our theology of Jesus. We could preach on that, no problem. But Jesus doesn't say that. He says, you are the salt. You are the light. So God chooses to work through us. God has a mission to save the world, and it's called the church. It's us. And this is the way I'm convinced that we will have the greatest impact on our community, is if we actually embody this. Go beyond just being nice to being radical Christ-like followers. And I'll close with this. There was a young man listening to Jesus on that hill. A young man named Simon. And later on, Jesus called him Peter. And Peter grew to be an older man. And when Peter was an older man, he wrote a letter to a bunch of Christians. And he remembered what Jesus said about being salt and light. And this is what Peter wrote. Oops, where'd it go? To his church. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles." These Christians don't belong. We're aliens. You get that? We're from heaven. We don't belong here, but we're here for a time. So he says, "I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." Listen to this. "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us." That's our task this morning, to live such good lives among the pagans that they notice and that they give glory to our Father in heaven. That's our call this morning. So for too long, the lives of Christians have been a hindrance to Christianity. People say, I like Jesus, but I'm not crazy about the Christians. They're kind of a bunch of hypocrites. They say this, but they do that. So this morning, let's take one step in undoing that. Let's start caring about the things Jesus cared about. How about you read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 this week and say, Holy Spirit, show me how to live this out. Let's live the way Jesus lived, first and foremost with each other. We have to have something to invite people to, a healthy, growing family. And that's going to spill over into our community. And I think a good number of them are going to see that, and they're going to give glory to our Father who is in heaven.